Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for tuning in to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. Good morning. There's been a song on my heart, so I'm going to sing a little bit of that song before we get started. I've been in the singing role since this weekend, doing some caroling. But this is not a caroling song. Amazing grace shall always be my song of praise. Good morning. For it was grace that bought my liberty. I just don't know how he came to love me so. He looked beyond my faults, and he saw my need. I shall forever lift my eyes to Calvary, to view the cross where my Savior died for me. How marvelous was that grace that caught my falling soul. He looked beyond my faults, and he saw my need. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I want to say good morning to everyone. We are in our Teachable Tuesday today, and as you know, on Teachable Tuesdays, we take a little time to talk about Black history, Black America, issues of race, politics, prison industrial complex, etc. And this Tuesday, we're continuing our look at Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, as well as the Black bourgeoisie. I did find my list of questions from the giveaways, and I wanted to go over just a couple of those because all of them were answered correctly. So all prizes went out yesterday, and most of them should be coming to those of you who got them right. Most of your prizes should be here by this Thursday, which was my goal, to get most of everything to you all before Christmas. All right, so you guys get early Christmas. All right, so some of the questions that I asked were, what two territories does the U.S. control? If you don't know what those are, that is Puerto Rico. All right, it's not a state, it's a territory. And the BVI, which is the British Virgin Islands. Two hurricanes that caused major devastation this year were Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma to the mainland U.S. All right. Who is sixth in line to the British throne? He's currently fifth in line, but will be sixth in line once these children come into the world, and that is Prince Harry. We said, what was another one? Well-known people who died this year. I had down Hugh Hefner, Della Reese, Dick Gregory. There were lots of people who died this year. And so you could have picked any two of them to answer the question. What amendment does everyone want to invoke when it comes to number 45? The answer was the 25th Amendment, which talks about his inability or mental incapability to be in office. But we also know that people also want to utilize the articles of impeachment. All right. What hashtag was connected to exposing sexual abuse, sexual violence, sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct this year? And that hashtag was #MeToo. All right. Name 3 events connected to race in politics and sports this year. And I told you I had a whole list of them. You had the Charlottesville incident with Heather Heyer. You had the Kaepernick incident. You had the NFL boycott, and that's still ongoing. You had issues with commentary by Ray Lewis and Cam Newton and Jamel Hill from ESPN. You had Mike Pence getting into that fray by choosing to walk out of a NFL game, quote unquote, because he was offended by players kneeling. But it turned out that it was a political staging. Trump, had something to do with him going down there to do that. Papa John's getting into the fray, and then the racists coming alongside and saying, hey, we're going to endorse Papa John's as our official white supremacist pizza. And then Papa John's having to go back and say, oh, no, I don't want to be identified with real outspoken white supremacists. I just want to be, a bit closet racist. And I want to give some dog whistles. But when the dogs come running to your whistle, then he backs away. All right. And there was also, of course, the whole alt-right movement, which is just Nazis by another name. There was the DREAM Act, right? DACA. There was and the Muslim ban. So a lot of things this year were tied to race or politics or sports. All right. There were lots of hashtags: white privilege, social justice, police brutality, end racism. All right. All of that was attached to race, politics, or sports. And the other question, I didn't go through them all, but the other question I asked was, what was the controversial song by OJ this year? And some people gave me the album title, which was 444, I believe, but the song title was The Story of OJ. All right. So that was our trivia questions from Friday. Let's get into our reading. You can put some hearts on the screen if you are having a great and wonderful day. You're having an excellent day. Put some hearts on the screen. And hopefully you are having a great and wonderful day. I want to thank those of you all who are watching by YouTube. Feel free to share this broadcast as well on any of your platforms. So let's get back into Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. We're in chapter 8, which is the forced migration. We may make it to chapter 9, which is the slave trade in the New World. So let's read. A process of capture and transport was set in motion by the slave trade that changed maritime history, economic history, and created an immigrant population in the Caribbean islands and in the Americas, who were forced out of their homes against their will. The basis of this force was the need and greed of Europe. Their forced migration was a process that ignored the humanity of a large portion of humankind. This process, set in motion during the latter part of the 15th century, would last over 300 years until slavery was turned into colonization, a more sophisticated form of slavery. There's a need now to look at this process and how it was set in motion. Most of the information used for this examination is taken from the article, African Slave Trade, The Cruelest Commerce, in September 1992, published by National Geographic by Colin Palmer, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and from Basil Davidson's Black Mothers, The Years of the African Slave Trade, and A. Adu Bowen's The Coming of the Europeans. To set the process in motion, the African was totally dehumanized. All right, put some hearts on the screen if you can still see and hear me. I had an unexpected caller. Sorry. All right. Everybody's screen okay? You can see and hear me? Good. Okay. Here we go. To set the process in motion, the African was totally dehumanized in the minds of the Europeans. So far as most of them were concerned, the Africans were outside of the grace of God. Africans became living commodities in a world trade system that laid the basis for modern capitalism. The Middle Passage, the condition of the transfer of the Africans across the Atlantic to the various ports of embarkation where they were sold to be slaves, is the most tragic story of forced migration in human history. Europe took full advantage of wars and conflicts between the West African tribes and nations, and they began to purchase some of the captives and prisoners of war as slaves. The kind of slavery that the European was about to introduce into West Africa had no relation to the African system of indentured servitude. Now, many times, if you run into a white supremacist, they're going to say, well, why was it a problem when we enslaved you all, when over in West Africa, your people were enslaving you as well, right? That's one of the arguments. But again, the West African relationship and the African system of indentured servitude had no relationship to chattel slavery that dehumanized people. All right? So there's not a comparison to be made there. In the African system, the slave was usually a loser in a local war. He was not enslaved separate from his family, and no slave was sent outside of Africa. Some slaves with talent rose to be kings in the very house in which they had been slaves. The word slave in West Africa had an entirely different meaning than it had when used by Europeans. The slave in Africa did not lose his or her humanity. Okay, they were not treated as a good or a package or property in the sense of what happened with chattel slavery. All right. Some African chiefs or kings became corrupt and went into the slave trade because they wanted to. The Europeans sold firearms to one African group to either protect themselves or capture another group. The European gunpowder, rum, and cheap bric-a-brac coming from the embryo of what would eventually become the European Industrial Revolution was traded for slaves. In every slave fort in West Africa, there is a door of no return. The captured slaves went out of this door to the beach and subsequently to the boats that would take them away from their home forever. The condition on these boats was anything beyond described in a concentration camp or in a chain gang in the South of the 1920s and 1930s. Good morning to all. Professor Colin Palmer described the condition and the establishment of these slaveholding forts in the following manner. To facilitate trade, forts were established along the West African coast. The Gold Coast, contemporary Ghana, saw construction of more than 50 such posts along 300 miles of coastline. The larger forts were called castles. Among the best known we know is Elmina Castle in Ghana, and it was built by the Portuguese in 1482, but fell to the Dutch in 1637. Cape Coast Castle, begun by the Swedes in 1653, was later held by the Dey or ruler of the Fetu people. It was acquired by the Dutch in 1664 and then by the English in 1665. This castle could accommodate more than 1,000 slaves. Professor Palmer further informs us that the Atlantic Passage tested bodies and souls to their limits. The human cargoes were arranged on wooden platforms like books on a shelf on various levels in the cramped hold. Rarely was there space for an adult to stand erect. Some had barely enough room to lie down. One ship surgeon observed that the traders wedged them in so that they didn't have as much room as a man in his coffin, in either length or breadth. It was impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. Some traders, of course, realized that that kind of crowding increased the incidence of disease and death. One agent of the Royal African Company complained in 1704 of inadequate space on the ship the Postilion. The slaves are so large, and it being the general opinion that slaves could not be healthy in the space of 3 feet, they broke up one of the platforms, which was the reason she could not carry more than 100 slaves. 8 years later, the company advised its agents at Cape Coast Castle, Pray laid no more than are necessary to prevent mortality, which has often happened by crowding the ship with too many Negroes. Not until the 18th century did European countries engage in the trade set standards for the allocation of space to slaves. It may be doubted whether the rules were obeyed. Fearing rebellion, ships' crews generally chained the slaves securely in the hold, usually in pairs, the right ankle of one connected to the left ankle of the other. James Penny, who commanded trading vessels for more than 20 years, recounted that when no danger is apprehended, their fetters are by degrees taken off. With so many bodies closely packed together, the heat below decks became unbearable. The air reeked of excrement and infected sores. By the 18th century, ships customarily had portholes to aid ventilation, wind sails to throw down a current of air, and grating on the decks, but to the human cargo, the whole remained a fetid hell. A cruel philosophical argument developed among the slave traders between the concept of tight packing and loose packing. When the slaves were tightly packed on the ship, more could be loaded on, but more died. In loose packing, more survived the journey because they had breathing space, because fewer slaves were packed on the ship. Therefore, when slaves arrived at the port of debarkation, they were in a healthier condition. The argument for this would go on for another 100 years. There's a small library of literature on the Middle Passage, some written by actual captains of the slave ships. The rationale and pretense in England was that the slave was primitive, unchristian, and that slavery brought them under the tutelage of Christianity. Other slave trading nations took the same attitude. The best literature illustrating this rationale came from the Catholic and Protestant Church. It is time that we look at least briefly at slavery and what is referred to as the New World and how it developed. So, here's the problem with the rationale. The rationale said that the slave was primitive and unchristian. Well, now we know that that's probably not accurate, because some of the slaves would have been Muslim, but they would have been Muslim converts. And so if they converted from being Muslims, what were they before they were Muslim? And then if we go further back, what was the early church? They were Africans. They were Christians. So how do we get from the early church being African, Christian, and bishops over to converted Muslims that get shipped off to the New World? All right, I do have some books on it, but we won't go into those today. Chapter 9, the slave trade in the New World. The Africans were no strangers to the New World. They seem to have been in North America and South America long before Columbus. This is more than an assumption, thanks to the research of Professor Leo Weiner, reported in his Africa and the Discovery of America, and the work of Harold G. Lawrence in another book called African Explorers to the New World. The first Africans who came to the New World were not in bondage, contrary to popular belief. And most history books have not fixed this. All right? Most history books that children are getting in public school believe that the only contact the Africans had to the New World was when they were brought here in chains in 1619 and 1620, which is not accurate. All right? So if you're a parent, please make sure your child has accurate history, because they're not getting it from public school. All right? And if they are, that's a really special public school, and I'd like to know the name of it so I can give them a shout out. Africans participated in some of the early expeditions, mainly with Spanish explorers. The best known of these African explorers was Estevanico, sometimes known as Little Stephen, who accompanied the de Vaca expedition during 6 years of wandering from Florida to Mexico. The remarkable thing about Estevanico, who came to America in 1527, is that he was a remarkable linguist. He learned the language of the Indians in a matter of weeks. Because of his knowledge of herbs and medicines, he was accepted as a deity by some Indian tribes. In 1539, Estevanico set out from Mexico in a party with Fray Marcos de Niza in search of the fabulous 7 cities of Cibola. When most of the expedition, including Fray Marcos, became ill, Estevanico went on alone and opened up what is now known as New Mexico and Arizona. A number of historians have stated that Pedro Nino, one of the pilots of the command ship of Christopher Columbus, was an African. In the discovery of the Pacific in 1513, Balboa carried 30 Africans who helped clear the road across the isthmus between the two oceans. In the conquest of Mexico, Cortez was accompanied by a number of Africans. Incidentally, one was a pioneer of wheat farming in the New World. In the exploration of Guatemala, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela, Africans arrived nearly 100 years before they reappeared as slaves in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Thus, Africans were major contributors to the making of the New World, and they did not come culturally empty-handed. Many of the Africans brought to the New World such skills as ironworking, leatherworking, and carpentry. Before the breaking up of the social structure of the West African states such as Ghana and Songhai, and the internal strife that made the slave trade possible, many Africans, especially West Africans, lived in a society in which university life was fairly common and scholars were held in reverence. In that period in Western African history, the University of Sankore at Timbuktu was flourishing, and its great chancellor, the last of monumental scholars of West Africa, Ahmed Baba, reigned over that university. A great African scholar, he wrote 47 books, each on a separate subject. He received all of his education within Africa, and in fact, he did not leave the Western Sudan until he was exiled to Morocco during the invasion of 1594. So what is the point? The point is there existed in Africa prior to the beginning of the slave trade a cultural way of life that in many ways was equal, if not superior, to many of the cultures then existing in Europe. And the slave trade destroyed these cultures and created a dilemma that the African has not been able to extract himself from to this very day. And so when you look around and you see some of the exact same things playing out in the black community before they were all enslaved, what is she talking about? I'm glad you asked. Listen, let's go back. Before the breaking up of the social structure of the West African states, the internal strife between Africans made the slave trade possible. Let me say that one more time. For the black people in the back. For the black people with the dashikis on. For the black people with the crowns on their head. For the black people with the afros. For the black people saying you're not black enough. For the black people saying I'm blackety blacker than you. All right? The internal strife made the slave trade possible. So when people say to me, why aren't you talking about this, and why aren't you talking about that, and why aren't you throwing this person under the bus, and why aren't you laughing because this person is getting kicked out of the White House? Listen, we're not playing Connect Four, people. We're playing chess. All right? So understand that any kind of internal strife makes slave trading possible. Does everybody understand? Are we clear? Because while we're arguing over who we think is black enough, while we're arguing about who we think should lead the people, while we're arguing about who's more intellectual, Cornel West or Ta-Nehisi Coates, internal strife makes the slave trade possible. So, if what you have to say is not helping to free somebody, let me just suggest that you probably keep it to yourself and work on a plan for freeing people. All right? Just a little hint. There were in the Africans' past rulers who extended kingdoms into empires, great armies that subdued entire nations, generals who advanced the technique of military science, scholars with wisdom and foresight, and priests who told of gods that were kind and strong. But with the bringing of the African to the New World, every effort was made to destroy his memory of having ever been part of a free and intelligent people. Let me say that again. With the bringing of the African to the New World, every effort was made to destroy his memory of having ever been part of a free and intelligent people. Because if you understand that you came from free and intelligent people, whether you were indigenous to America or your ancestors came from Africa, if you understand that you were part of a free and intelligent people, then there's going to be some demand that you get your freedom and your knowledge back. All right? So when people start talking about black power was not to say black supremacy. Black power was to say, thank you for giving us what we already had. We're just getting back what we already had, which is our previous freedom and our previous knowledge. All right? And unfortunately, believe it or not, to many people, that is a threat to the current power structures. For you to be excited about your freedom and for you to realize that freedom allows you to get your knowledge back, that becomes a threat to people who would rather keep you ignorant. One of the most powerful quotes that I've heard ever in life, and it has stuck with me, is that in order to enslave a people, you must first make them illiterate, because illiterate people are easily enslaved. All right? So, the greatest destroyer, the author says here, of African culture, the greatest exploiter of the African was the plantation system of the New World. The African was transformed into something called a Negro. He was demeaned. This is the thing that is uniquely tragic about the African slave system. Of all the slave systems in the world, no other dehumanized the slave more than that started by the Europeans in the 15th century. Using the church as a rationale, they began to set up myths that nearly always read the African out of human history, beginning with the classification of the African as a lesser being. Now, any reading of scripture will let you know that the African is not a lesser being. But if you think of it this way, if you're being taught certain pieces of scripture, if you're being beat into submission, if you're being dehumanized in ways that even the recorded stuff is just an inkling of what was going on during that time, if you're being forced into incestuous practices with your mother, with your sister, etc., to become a breeding machine, that's dehumanizing. All right? The Catholic Church's justification for slavery was that the African was being brought under the guidance of Christendom and that he would eventually receive its blessings. Okay, if you can hear me and see me clearly, put some hearts on the screen if you're inside of the broadcast and you have the ability to do that. All right? The rationale was that slavery was a blessing to the African. It was not. Take any other people group, describe what happened to them, describe what happened to Africans, and then say, hey, we want to bless you with this life, and see how many of them would receive it. Zero. All right? Go around and ask some of your white friends. Ask them the question of, would you want to be black in America? And see what they say. They should want to say yes, because to say yes would indicate that you know and believe and understand that black people are treated just like you in this country. But the majority of them are going to say no, because they know that black people are not treated equally and fairly in our country. So then my next question would be, if you're going to say no, then why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you speaking out? Why aren't you communicating with those who are in power locally, all right, to make changes with a system that you know leaves African Americans, black people at a disadvantage? And the simple fact of the matter is, many of them are okay with the world as it is because it does not disadvantage them. The moment it starts disadvantaging them, which is about to be shortly, once this tax bill goes through, and once 13 million of them lose their health care, and the other part of them get their Medicaid and Social Security benefits diminished, when it starts to affect them, then you will see an outcry. All right? There were several competing slave systems in the New World. In order to understand the effects of these various systems on the personality of the Africans, we have to look at each one individually. In Cuba and Haiti, often the Africans were a majority in the population. This is also true of certain portions of Brazil. Therefore, the system operated differently in these areas, although it was still slavery. The African had some cultural mobility. In South America and in the West Indies, the slave master did not outlaw the African drum, African ornamentation, African religion, or other things dear to the African remembered from his former way of life. This permitted a form of cultural continuity among the slaves in the West Indies, Cuba, and South America that did not exist in the United States. In the Portuguese area in the West Indies and often in South America, the plantation owner would buy a shipload or a shipload of slaves. These slaves usually came from the same areas in Africa, and they naturally spoke the same language and had the same basic culture. Families in the main were kept together. If a slave on an island was sold to a plantation owner at the other end of the island, he could still walk to see his relatives. This made for a form of cultural continuity among slaves in South America, Cuba, and Haiti that later made their revolts more successful than the revolts in the United States. In the United States, in the fight to destroy every element of culture of the slaves, the system was much crueler. No other system did so much to demean the personality of the slave, to deny him his personhood, or to ruthlessly sell family members away from each other. The American slave system operated almost like the American brokerage system. If a person bought 20 slaves at the beginning of the week and found himself short of cash at the end of the week, he might, if the price was right, sell 10. These men might be resold within a few days. The family, the most meaningful entity of African life, was systematically and deliberately destroyed. So when people tell me, what about the black family? It's the black family. It's the father's fault that the black family has been destroyed. No, let's go back to the first historical baby daddies. Let's go back to the plantation owners that were impregnating women and then selling his own seed as property, as stock, as shares. All right? So people like to dump on the black family, but let's go back to the source of what happened to the black family and who was the actual culprit. In South America, the slave managed to stay in his group and therefore preserve some of his cultural continuity. In spite of these drastic drawbacks, the Africans in the Americas, including the United States, made a meaningful contribution to the preservation of the countries in which he was a slave. Another neglected aspect of the African in the New World is the role of the African women. Comparatively, few white women were brought to the New World during the first 100 years. Many families of the New World originated from cohabitation between the white slave master and the African woman. Later, this same slave master, especially in the U.S., made and supported laws forbidding his own child to have an education or sit beside him on public transportation. In Haiti, the African woman sometimes had a kind of semi-legal status. In South America, especially in Brazil, sometimes the white slave master married the African woman and she became a free person. These free African women in South America began to maneuver their husbands in an attempt to lessen the harshness of the slave system. In the United States, however, there could be no such maneuver. Haiti and Cuba during this early period were dominated by their mother countries. Wars were started within these countries to liberate them from their European masters. Africans made a meaningful contribution toward the early liberation of Cuba, Haiti, and other areas of South America. They fought with Simon Bolivar for the freedom of South America and fought valiantly to free Haiti from the domination of the French under Napoleon. In the United States, especially in the American Revolution, the African slave often took the place of a white person who decided that he did not want to fight and fought with the promise that he would get his freedom afterwards. Thousands of Africans fought in the American Revolution with this promise. And a little known incident in our history is that thousands of Africans fought with the British when the British made the same promise and the African believed them. Apparently, it depended on who got to him first. And of course, this is where you get all the controversy about the Star-Spangled Banner and the third stanza of the anthem that people sing that talks about Francis Scott Key's, how can I put it, his insulting of the quote-unquote hireling and the slave who had crossed over to fight against the United States with the British. All right. So he was in the song. It talks about there's no refuge for the hireling or the slave, and nothing can save them from the grave. And so the controversy around that became, why are we singing this song when it's actually insulting our ancestors who simply wanted to be free? The African was a major contributor in the making of the New World. The economy of the New World rested largely on slave labor. For many years, 1/3 of the trade of the New World was with the small island Santo Domingo, which later became Haiti. Haiti and the other Caribbean islands also influenced the economic system of Europe. Slavery and the slave trade was the first international investment in capital. It was the first large-scale investment that was intercontinental. Many Europeans invested in ships and in the goods and services taken from these African countries and became independently wealthy. But the slave revolts continued. By the end of the 17th century, the picture of slavery began to change drastically. Economic necessity, not racial prejudice, originally directed the slave trade in the New World. As early as 1663, a group of slaves joined a group of white indentured servants in a revolt. Some slaves took the Christian version of the Bible literally and believed that God meant for them to be free men. Slaves such as Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, who led a revolt of 40,000 slaves in 1800. In 1822, in Charleston, South Carolina, a carpenter, Denmark Vesey, planned one of the most extensive slave revolts on record, but he was betrayed and put to death with many of his followers. And in 1831, Nat Turner led the greatest slave revolt ever to occur in Virginia. The slaves never accepted their condition passively. That's something else that is portrayed in American public school books. That slaves were just happy Negroes willing to be subservient to the culture of the time. All right. Again, very few public school history books talk about the slave revolts. If you find a public school history book that talks about the slave revolts, please send me the name of it and send me the school that's allowing it to be taught. All right? Because I want to give them a shout out. In his book, American Negro Slave Revolts, Dr. Herbert Aptheker, records 250 slave revolts. Those were the ones recorded. All right? The African slave in the Americas, in addition to assisting in the freedom and the economy of these countries, made a major contribution to his freedom. In the story of the rise and fall of great African states and subsequently the slave trade, we are trying to deal with something much bigger than history itself. We are trying to deal with an old situation and a new situation and trying to address ourselves to the current cry for Black history and Black power. Our major point is this. The African people who became slaves in the United States have been many things in history, good and bad. They have ruled great nations. They have destroyed great nations. They are profoundly human, and they have played every role in the human drama, from saint to even buffoon. Slavery does not represent the sum total of our history. We are searching for a definition of our African heritage and to determine what it means to be a people emerging from bondage into the light of freedom, re-entering the mainstream world of history as participants. A good definition of heritage or history is this: Heritage is something acquired or transmitted by a predecessor. It is also called a legacy or a tradition or a birthright. But when we speak of our people, perhaps a new and better definition is in order. In his book, Tom Tom, John Vandercock said, "A race is like a man. Until it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, and loves its own memories, it can never fulfill itself completely. Heritage, in essence, is how a people have used their talents to command the respect of other people. The ultimate purpose of our heritage and heritage teaching is to show our people how through identity and through respect for themselves, they can work to liberate themselves from the old ties of bondage. A person's relationship to his heritage, after all, is the same as the relationship of a child to its mother." And what we're seeing in our culture is the more that African Americans decide to remove themselves from old ties of bondage, to connect with their heritage, to learn and study their past, to show respect for themselves, to show pride in themselves and each other, the more things come along to try to prevent that from happening. All right? People are upset because Black people are choosing to see themselves as equal, as human, as worthy as anyone else of being treated equally. And believe it or not, that upsets people. All right? Now, let's go back to the Black bourgeoisie, because from this point in history up into the 1950s, all right, you had this continual, consistent struggle. And then out of this struggle, you had a group of people who decided, we're not going to identify with the struggle anymore. We want to assimilate into whiteness. We have a mixed heritage that makes us believe that we can deny the struggle and assimilate into whiteness. But then they came to find out that white people didn't want their assimilation. All right. And now we see in our current culture that, and people have been sending me stuff since we first started teaching on this, but now we see in our current culture, you turn on your television and you're going to see white male, black female, black male, white female. And again, I don't have anything against interracial relationships. I'm just telling you, what is the science behind it? Because everybody is not doing it because they're in love. All right. There's a specific group of people who understand that they are at extinction rate. And the only way they're not going to be further along in extinction is to begin to intermarry. All right. This is not something that's new. It's a cultural practice that has been going on for centuries. We're just seeing it again in our day and age. All right. So again, Black bourgeoisie, the first thing we talked about last week is that they're trying to remove themselves from what is called the mark of oppression. And actually, I'm going to post it hopefully on my Daring Dialogues once I get done. But somebody actually sent me a video showing this exact thing. Upper middle class family, African American male, and he was talking about how he wants his sons to be able to live. He wants his sons to be able to survive. And he basically was saying, look, listen, I just want my sons to be able to come home and not fear. And so he was saying how he changed his son's dress code and how they're not allowed to wear hoodies. They're only allowed to wear like khakis, and he was pulling, their clothes out of the closet. And, someone sent me the clip and they asked, well, what do you think about this? And I said, well, you have to understand that Malcolm and Martin were assassinated wearing suits. They weren't wearing hoodies. They weren't wearing baggy jeans. They didn't have their pants hanging down. All right. So what am I trying to convey? I'm trying to let you know that when a person's mind, all right, is distorted to think of somebody as less than them because of the color of their skin, all right, sometimes dressing up has nothing to do with that. All right? It's not about clothing for them. It's about the fact that they consider you inferior regardless of what clothes you have on. So, you know, you have a group of people thinking, I can fix this problem if I just change my clothes. Not necessarily. The other thing the man said in the video is that his sons, you know, have to speak in a certain way. They don't look at the person that's talking to them. They smile and try to be, you know, act a little more friendlier and those kinds of things. And the reality is, again, for some of these people that have this mindset, it's not about how cordial you can be. It's not about the clothes you wear. It's not about how cordial you can be. There is an innate hatred for anything unlike themselves. All right? So one of the things that I shared is that as much as you want to prevent certain things from occurring, in the society in which we live, there are going to be some people that no matter how intelligent you are, no matter how cordial you are, no matter how you present yourself outwardly, that is not what makes them hate you. All right? Their mind has been made up that color matters above everything else. All right? So this group of people trying to remove themselves from any mark of oppression will run up against people who don't care about your titles, your position, your labels, your money, your outward appearance, your cordialness. To them, you are still the N-word. All right? And that's what Jay-Z's song was expressing. Whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you are male, whether you are female, whether you are kind, whether you're not kind, in some people's eyes, unfortunately, it still doesn't matter to them. All right? So you have to be aware that there's people in the world like that, that think with that level of ignorance. And you can't stop living your life because you're going to come up against people who have that level of ignorance. You still have to have the courage and the ability to be you. Just be you. All right? Because people are going to do and they're going to say and they're going to act out in ways that may not have a logical explanation. All right? So I'm going to post that. Hopefully I'll be able to get the link and post it to my Daring Dialogues page. But it was a perfect example of what we talked about last week. Second part we're going to go into today is insecurities and frustrations. Insecurities and frustrations. And we're going to read as much as we can and find a good stopping point. Since the black bourgeoisie cannot escape identification with Negroes, they experience certain feelings of insecurity because of their feeling of inferiority. Their feeling of inferiority is revealed in their fear of competition with whites. There is first a fear of competition for jobs, notwithstanding the fact that middle-class Negroes are the most vociferous in demanding the right to compete on equal terms with whites. Many of them still fear such a competition. They prefer the security afforded by their monopoly of certain occupations within the segregated Negro community. For example, middle-class Negroes demand that 2 Negro medical schools be reserved for Negro students and that a quota be set for white students, though Negro students are admitted to white medical schools. Since the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled against segregated public schools, many Negro teachers, even those who are well prepared, fear that they cannot compete with whites for teaching positions. Although this fear stems principally from a feeling of inferiority, which is experienced generally by Negroes, it has other causes. The majority of the black bourgeoisie fear competition partly because such competition would mean that whites were taking them seriously, and consequently, they would have to assume a more serious and responsible attitude towards their work. Middle-class Negroes, who are notorious for their inefficiency in the management of various institutions, excuse it on the grounds that Negroes are a young race and therefore will require time to attain efficiency. The writer has heard a Negro college president who has constantly demanded that Negroes have equality declare before white people the shortcomings of his own administration, that Negroes were a child race and that they had to crawl before they could walk. Such declarations, while flattering to the whites, are revealing in that they manifest the black bourgeoisie's contempt for the Negro masses while excusing his own deficiencies by attributing them to the latter. It is clear that the black workers who must gain a living in a white man's mill or factory and in competition cannot offer any such excuse for his inefficiency. The fear of competition with whites is probably responsible for the black bourgeoisie's fear of competence and first-rate performance within his own ranks. When a Negro is competent and insists upon first-rate work, it appears to this class that he is trying to be a white man, or that he is insisting that Negroes measure up to white standards. This is especially true where the approval of whites is taken as a mark of competence and first-rate performance. In such cases, the black bourgeoisie reveal their ambivalent attitudes towards the white world. They slavishly accept the estimate which almost any white man places upon a Negro or his work, but at the same time they fear and reject white standards. For example, when a group of Negro doctors were being shown the modern equipment and techniques of a white clinic, one of them remarked to a Negro professor in a medical school, "This is the white man's medicine. I never bother with it and I still make $30,000 a year." Negroes who adopt the standards of the white world create among the black bourgeoisie a feeling of insecurity and often become the object of both envy and hatred of this class. Among the women of the black bourgeoisie, there's an intense fear of competition of white women for Negro men. They are often attempt to rationalize their fear by saying that the Negro man always occupies an inferior position in relation to the white woman, or that he marries much below his social status. They come nearer to the source of their fear when they confess that there are not many eligible Negro men and that these few should marry Negro women. That such rationalization conceals deep-seated feelings of insecurity is revealed by the fact that generally they have no objection to the marriage of white men to Negro women, especially if the white man is reputed to be wealthy. Hence, we are still seeing in our culture with Meghan Markle. In fact, they take pride in the fact and attribute these marriages to the peculiar charms of Negro women. In fact, the middle-class Negro woman's fear of the competition of white women is based upon often the fact that she senses her own inadequacy or shortcoming. Her position in Negro society and in the larger Negro community is often due to some adventitious factor, such as a lighter complexion or a meager education, which has pushed her to the top of the social pyramid. The white middle-class white woman not only has a white skin and straight hair, but she is more generally sophisticated and interesting because she has read more widely and has been exposed to a larger view of the world. The middle-class Negro woman may make fun of the plainness of her white competitor and the lacker's lack of wealth and interest in society. Nevertheless, she still feels that they appear as even potential competitors. Both men and women among the black bourgeoisie have a feeling of insecurity because of their constant fear of the loss of status. Since they have no status in the larger American society, there is an intense struggle of status amongst middle-class Negroes, as we have seen, an attempt to compensate for the contempt and low esteem of white people. Great value is therefore placed upon all kinds of status symbols, such as academic degrees, both real and honorary, are sought in order to secure status. Usually the symbols are of a material nature, implying wealth and conspicuous consumption. Sometimes Negro doctors do not attend what are supposedly scientific meetings because they do not have a Cadillac or some such expensive automobile. School teachers wear mink coats and maintain homes beyond their incomes for fear that they may lose status. The extravagance in social life generally is due to an effort to not lose status, but in attempting to overcome their fear of loss of status, they are often beset with new feelings of insecurity. In spite of their pretended wealth, they are aware that their incomes are insignificant and that they must struggle to maintain their mortgaged homes and the show of wealth in lavish social affairs. They are beset by a feeling of insecurity because of their struggles to maintain a show of wealth through illegal means. From time to time, oh my gosh. All right. Can you all hear and see me? I've never had this many calls and interruptions when I'm doing a broadcast. Ever. Put some hearts on the screen if you can still see and hear me. All right. So hopefully our broadcast will not be choppy. We're getting ready to close this particular section. From time to time, wealthy Negro doctors are arrested for selling narcotics or performing abortions. The life of many a wealthy Negro doctor is shortened by the struggle to provide diamonds, minks, and an expensive home for his wife. There is much frustration among the black bourgeoisie despite their privileged position within the segregated Negro world. Their wealth and social position cannot erase the fact that they are generally segregated and rejected by the white world. Their incomes and occupations may enable them to escape the cruder manifestations of racial prejudice, but they cannot insulate themselves against the more subtle forms. These discriminations cause frustrations in Negro men because they are not allowed to play the masculine role as defined by the American culture. They cannot assert themselves or exercise power as white men do. When they protest against racial discrimination, there's always the threat that they will be punished by the white world. In spite of the movement toward wider integration of the Negro into the general stream of American life, middle-class Negroes are still threatened with the loss of positions and earning power if they insist upon their rights. After the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that segregation in public education was illegal, Negro teachers in some parts of the South were dismissed because they would not sign statements supporting racial segregation in education. All right? So, the main thing that we want to get out of today, and we're going to continue this next week, is this. Status symbols cover insecurity with the black bourgeoisie. All right? And you have to think about the time in which that was written. And then look at our current society. Look at the upper black middle class and ask yourself, do I still see some of these same traits and characteristics now? Is the main thrust of upper middle class wealthy blacks still status symbols? Is there still a fear of being disliked by white society? Is there still a fear of black men of this particular class being very few, and so there is a competition between them, black females, and white females for men of this particular status? So ask yourself, do we still see characteristics of the black bourgeoisie playing out now, or are we past that point? All right, and we're going to continue that reading on next Tuesday. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues. I hope that you have learned something today. I hope that I've given you something to think about concerning our culture and our history. I want to encourage you to tune in tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be in our Relationship Wednesday, and we'll be talking to married, single, courting, and engaged. We try to cover you all on Wednesday. All right? And I don't care how long you've been married, whether you've been married 30 days or 30 years, there's always something that you can learn to improve your own marriage relationship. All right? So, again, I hope that you all will join me tomorrow. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out and be light today. All right? Take care, and God bless. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. And thank you again, YouTube watchers and streamers, for your time and attention. Take care, and God bless.